First of all, thank you, Commissioner Farley, for really placing the whole purpose of this meeting into context. So I think that's really something for us to think about, how we can take the lessons that we're going to hear about over the next couple of days and apply them to the work that we do. Let me introduce our panel. I guess I should probably start by introducing myself. I'm Les Beich. I have a day job at Florida State University College of Medicine, and I'm a recovering public health practitioner. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, even though our group is not in alphabetical order. That would be no fun if we did it, that way. First, let me introduce Dr. Nicole Alexander Scott, and she is the director of the Rhode Island Department of Health, and she's also ASTO president, and we're going to hear from her this morning. Let me also introduce John Auerbach, and John is currently the CEO and president of Trust for America's Health, but he's also been a local and state health commissioner and has been very active in public health. I think many of you recognize and know him. And immediately on my right is Alonzo Plow, who's the vice president at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but has an extensive public health background as commissioner of health in several very large metropolitan cities. And Kevin Sumner, who's last but not least, but alphabetically at the end, who is a local health official across the river in New Jersey, a couple hours away, and is the current NACCHO president. So maybe just to kick things off, if it's okay with all of you, and maybe we can even go alphabetically for a second, just to get us going. Maybe just... If no one here listens beyond our first 20 minutes or so, could you take several minutes and share with them, before their coffee, they may not kick in forever here. Tell us what you want them to know about building resilience in your communities. So their take-home message, let's start with the nuggets. So can I ask you to start?
Absolutely.
Nicole?
It's an honor to be here. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. An extra thank you to Whitney and Heidi, who are passing out copies of our ASTO President's Challenge that we've been honored to partner with the National Association of County and City Health Officials to roll out, as well as joining with the Surgeon General to roll out. And you'll see on that document a specific reference to community resilience. What we really want to focus on with this challenge together is elevating the voice of the community. We know that it is necessary to change the direction that we've been going in with the life expectancy trend of the last several years. And one of the things we can certainly say with seeing that people have not been living as long is that what we are doing currently is not working effectively. And so one of the ways that we learn from other countries that are not seeing a downward trend and see where we have an opportunity in our country is to take some of the overinvestment that we have in the healthcare setting and shift it towards the underinvestment that exists at the community level with addressing determinants of health, prevention, public health work, and some of the ambulatory care that we know is important. And so this challenge helps us realize how to elevate the voice of the community. And so the first goal of the challenge is to equip health officials at the state, local, territorial, and tribal levels to mobilize community leadership and community members to activate place-based initiatives so that we can actually address the determinants of health that exist. We love in Rhode Island to talk about the Health Equity Zones initiative, which is one of the ways that we braid funding and give it to the community while implementing the public health principles that were just shared. We want to help communities organize so that they can collaborate, use data to assess what their needs are, develop an action plan, implement it, moving towards specific outcomes, and then evaluate it to continue to make sure there's improvement so that we can build community capacity. The reason why that's important is because of our description of community resilience. We describe community resilience as equipping communities to resist respond to and recover from adversity, and specifically so that communities can bounce forward, not what we often say, which is bounce back after larger adversities or the everyday adversities that communities face. We want communities to bounce forward to better socioeconomic and environmental conditions with things like having fewer adverse childhood events as one of those goals. So that is a focal point, and we know our second goal with our major challenge is encouraging public health to reach across to non-traditional sectors and partners to help achieve this new focus on the community. And so that's engaging with policymakers differently, engaging with commerce realm differently, and other partners who would understand and realize the importance of investing in their surrounding community. So we want to treat community resilience as not just a response to some sort of adverse event. Preparedness is an important part to that, but also to build the capacity and strength of a community so that they can resist, respond to, and recover from the everyday adversities that many communities face. And I'll stop there with that.
Wow, that was a great opening, Nicole. So Kevin, I know you have worked a lot with Nicole and again, making this a joint sort of ASTO-NACCHO sort of initiative. So could we turn to you for your kind of nugget as well?
That's fine, except that I had this great thing about your alphabetical being at the end
I'm
of the
bad
list.
on the alphabet. I was
I'm not
afraid
having to say anything because it had all been said already.
So you want me to go back to the alphabet?
No, that's fine. So, good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting us to be here. Nicole and I have been working on this for probably a year or more now. And when she first approached me about partnering with her ASTO challenge, and maybe I should step back and say that the NACCHO presidents have historically not done a challenge. We have some initiatives and activities that we do, and I had identified a few of those, but because of the relatively short term and the difference in the sizes of our organizations, the challenges didn't work very well. But when Nicole approached and asked if I would be willing to partner, and she explained what she was looking at, I thought it was a perfect fit. Some of my initiatives as NACCHO president were to redevelop existing and bolster existing partnerships and collaborations within and internal and external to the organization, as well as having a focus on small and medium-sized health departments across the country. And the ASTO challenge really aligned with both of those initiatives. And you heard her speak about the one piece of the challenge being the partnership and cross-sector partnership development, which was a perfect fit. The other thing that I thought when she approached me was that these are things local health departments are already trying to do across the country. I come at this term of resilience from a slightly different perspective. I spent about 20 years in emergency medical response, and so have a background in emergency preparedness. And we talk about resilience and systemization as the two big buckets in emergency preparedness. And if you have a robust system in place with lots of partners and cross-sector partnerships, that helps to make that community resilient. And if you focus on the community and the members of those communities to recover from those incidents, those one-time or multi-time, but those major incidents like hurricanes or flooding, then those communities bounce back. That's what we've always said, right? And you hear that a lot from elected officials when these incidents occur. We are a very resilient community. We'll recover from this. But the ASTO challenge and the public health piece of that, I think, is what Nicole expressed, in that it's not about bouncing back. It's about improving. It's not just internal quality improvement, but improvement of the community overall. And if we can take those basic principles of systemization from the emergency preparedness world and instill the public health piece into those traditional emergency responders and other partners, and we take that basic idea of resilience, then we have the ability to develop community-based, community-led initiatives that focus not just on recovery from a particular incident, but overall recovery and improvement of that community's health throughout time. And so the partnership between ASTO and NACCHO, the community-based piece, the partnership development that we talk about, all I think leads to greater resilience and improvement in health of our communities.
Is it okay if I go back to the alphabet again, Kevin?
Sure.
All right, I'm a little nervous now. John, do you want to jump into this conversation?
Sure. You know, I'm a former local health official and state health official, but my perspective now as the head of Trust for America's Health is at the national level and the federal level, and what can we do in terms of federal policy and federal initiatives that can address the issues that you've just heard mentioned. And I'd start by saying that as we've looked at this issue and become supportive of the work that ASTO and NACCHO are doing, we really have been in agreement with that and have thought about what are the implications of that on a federal level. I'd say the first part of it is to a recognition, as folks have mentioned, that we all need resilience because bad things happen to everyone. And so thinking about the capacity to be resilient and the systems in place to be resistant are important. But I think there's also a little bit of a challenge in an over-focus on resiliency, as we've seen some of the discussions at the federal level, because they assume that there's that trauma will happen and that bad things will happen. And the danger there is that while bad things happen to everyone, there's some communities where there's a greater likelihood of trauma and bad things happening, not just when there's a hurricane or when there's a crisis, but on a day-in, day-out basis as a result of poverty, racism, discrimination, and other conditions which just mean people are constantly under attack. And so the definition of resiliency that I think you've been hearing about isn't just about how do we respond when a really traumatic event occurs, but how do we think about what the causes of vulnerability are. And what we've seen over the last, I think, few decades has been that we're seeing greater pre-existing trauma that exists widespread in certain communities where there's elevated risk of illness, injury, and preventable death. And our work needs to be thinking about those root causes, as well as being resilient when bad things happen. How do we think about root causes? How do we move upstream? How do you work at the local state level where you can not just talk about that, but think we're actually doing something that's going to be reducing that level of trauma in a community? I think it's the challenge that we face now. At the national level, we think it's important to support what is taking place with Nicole's leadership and Kevin's leadership and to promote that. But we also think there's no getting around the fact that there has to be funding for this at the federal level. There has to be support so that there's money that's going out into the community to think about how to act upon and learn from and innovate as we address adverse childhood experiences and trauma. We don't have those resources now, and that's often why we feel like we don't exactly know what we can do in our organizations. We're working now at the national level to make the case that those funds need to exist that address root causes, social determinants of health, and those funds need to go out to communities, and there needs to be more and more efforts to promote the kind of activities that are in the health equity zones, learn from those, and have those scaled up throughout the country so that we're thinking, again, not just about resiliency, but reducing the need for resiliency because we're reducing trauma at a root level.
So John, it sounds like you're really promoting a nice prevention agenda. Alonzo, turning to you from a standpoint of, clearly you're at a philanthropic organization, so a little bit different from government, and yet you have many years of local and very large city governmental experience. Can you join this conversation?
Thank you. I will join. Thank you.
Later we'll ask you guys to join.
Yeah.
So.
No, great to be here. I'm glad you said that. I'm a long-time local public health practitioner and a relatively short-time philanthropist, but what I want to share are probably lessons along the way through that continuum that relate to this. And I'll do it kind of chronologically in some of the work that I've done around community preparedness and resilience that kind of informs what I think the take-home points are. The first, and I think all of you as public health practitioners recognize on resilience and community is that it involves deep partnering and deep engagement with the community. And I think we've moved a lot beyond resilient preparedness. How many of you, raise your hand if you entered the preparedness field when all we talked about was bioterrorism? Okay, so 10 years ago, everybody would have raised their hand. That would have been the lens that we used. Very risk-specific, very non-community contextual. So the first lesson I learned with my colleague David Eisenman over here, and I'm pitching his session following on the LA Community Disaster Resilience Project, is we as a field had to reframe from a single hazard focus, sometimes of relatively low probability compared to other hazards people were living with every day, the kind of despair and inequality that John's talking about, and begin to reconceptualize the field as one that really is dealing with fundamental community engagement, social cohesion, and connectedness. And when we were talking about how we could move from the classic preparedness notion of a I am prepared to a we are prepared, from kits and plans to community cohesion and connectivity, big breakthrough. And David will talk to you more about billboards that we had up saying your preparedness starts with hello. Your neighbors are your first responders. In an earthquake-prone Los Angeles, that is an actuality in terms of emergency response context. So first lesson is it's very important to think about resilience rooted in community dynamics and in kind of an all hazards and life experience context. Second thing, and it relates to one thing Dr. Farley said, the second experience that I think the take-home point I would make is from our engagement, and John's been involved with this and others, on the National Health Security Preparedness Index. So metrics are important. And a recent National Academy of Science report kind of summarizing various approaches to resilience measures cited about 45 different efforts around how you measure resilience. If there are 45 constructs, that says we have work to do, because I think science is about parsimony, and I think we're not there yet. But so the metrics are important. National Security Preparedness Index, that I hope some of you are familiar with, is something the foundation funds. John works with it too. But the thing about measuring resilience, however we measure it, also has to be meaningful and connected to community. And measures are only as good as they catalyze actions that change these fundamental determinants that create inequality in resilience response in communities. So, I'm an epidemiologist. I would never say metrics and precise metrics aren't important, but the role of metrics is to get to action, to the kind of changes we need to make and the differences that we want to make. So that's lesson number 2. The third thing, current involvement, Gulf Research Program, National Academy of Sciences. How many of you from the Gulf states? Any people from the Gulf states? All right, a situation of continuing threats of disasters, hurricanes, you know that. National Academies, this project funded by the settlement from BP for the Horizon thing. The challenges of talking about resilience in a region where jobs are created and necessary for economic components of resilience, from oil, from chemical. I just left a meeting in Houston. That economic base that those industries provide is important. important capital, economic capital to resilience, but they're also a constant threat. So when you're looking at what they're looking at, which is how over the next 30 or 40 years we improve resilience in the Gulf, how do you understand the interplay of these different capitals, economic, social, political, natural environment? There's another fifth one I can never remember. But those are the kinds of things that the Gulf program is trying to think about when you're thinking about the interplay. So that's a very important part of resilience. Some things seem like they're in contradistinction to each other, but all of them need to come together. Last thing I'll mention, and I think about resilience in this one all the time, and it relates to Dr. Farley's last comments, the opioid crisis. This needs to be situated as a disaster. It's a chronic disaster. It's of large scale. The ways that we approach preparedness and disaster response should be, we should think about that with the opioid crisis. I have some days it's the privilege and some days it's really difficult to be co-chairing the National Academy of Medicine's two-year project on how do we, what should we do about the opioid crisis. What gets missed, and I think it came up in Dr. Farley's comments, is that is a crisis of actually what John talked about, chronic marginalization in populations, cultures of despair. Certainly the current focus of that has been Appalachia and other places, but that same culture of despair was there in the crack cocaine crisis. We just marginalized people and didn't deal with those resilient issues our lack of resilience in those communities. So I think we also need to be able to frame resilience beyond a classic disaster framework, but one of any kind of ongoing crisis that creates the kind of impact that we see with the opioid. So bottom line take-home points from my experience are social cohesion, a sense of we-ness, and a deep commitment to community engagement and equity are the principal components of dealing with resilience.
So I think the work of this panel's done. You just answered all the questions I was going to ask. Well, maybe we can drill a little bit deeper on a couple issues. That was great for just teeing up, I think, some of the things we need to dig more deeply in as a group. And I should have maybe prefaced a few things. So I live in North Florida. We're about 6 months past Hurricane Michael that kind of rolled through and devastated a huge part of the panhandle of Florida and areas around it that were also areas that were in many ways deeply impacted by the Deepwater Horizon events. And some of those places had been receiving funding as a result of that event to build community resilience. And there was a specific project called the Gulf Region Health Outreach Project that was a very well-funded, I thought, very successful effort. And we'll talk about the definition of success here in a little bit. You're taking everyone's water.
I'm taking everybody's water.
Right. It's about group cohesion.
I know.
Okay.
Sharing.
And yet those very same communities were really seriously impacted and clearly have not bounced back in a way that we would hope. And so it raises a whole lot of questions. So let me go back and maybe ask a few specific things and let you guys weigh in. So some of the things we've talked about are natural disasters, clearly, and then there's man-made or unnatural disasters, and some just slowly evolving natural disasters that we can see, like the opiate crisis in front of us. Are those things really how are they similar? How are they different in terms of our construct for community resilience? And who would like to kick that one off, since clearly I don't know the alphabet and I'm struggling.
Well, if we kept the trend going, what's the difference, so to speak, in terms of how we approach community resilience with each of those types of disasters? I think one of the keys and the take-homes that we hope will come from this discussion, and certainly part of what we hope to highlight through the President's Challenge, is the difference may be the timing and the need to respond during an emergency event, but recognizing that when we talk about community resilience in particular, we are not just talking about responding to those types of emergency events. We're actually more so talking about the types of adversities that happen on a daily basis to communities, particularly those that are disadvantaged. We're also talking about getting at the root causes of some of the policies and systems that have been set up in those communities that have contributed to their disadvantage, and being able to address some of the needs. We have the description of why for the President's Challenge, and we have to be able to promote social connectivity and really talk about the importance of that connectedness, because that is going to help build the community resilience. And when we talk about knowing that the community has to go first, within public health realm and within academia, oftentimes we feel like we are responsible to go into the community, tell them what their problem is, and tell them how to fix it so that they can improve the community resilience over the long term that's needed. And we want to shift that. We want to change how we as public health practitioners or academia or others interface with our community members and have them be the voice that leads. Because when you actually do listen, those in the communities that are living with these conditions that exist have some solutions on how to address it. And the thing we can bring to the table is some public health principles, similar to what Dr. Farley spoke of earlier, where we have data to assess what those needs are. We develop an action plan with measurable outcomes. We implement it and we evaluate it and support the community in doing that. So there's a structured approach where there are shared goals that people are working towards and collective action that can result. Leaving here with the understanding that those are the tenets that really build community resiliency is what we hope to get from this, whether it's an immediate event from a natural disaster or, more importantly, from the everyday activities that occur in between those disasters.
I completely agree with what Nicole said. I would say that having gone through a number of different major emergencies, I think there's often a distinction between communities that are just chronically vulnerable when a bad thing happens because they have fewer resources and their transportation is difficult, even getting information out is difficult. That's sort of a chronic underlying problem, I think, that exists regardless of the emergency. But I actually think with specific kinds of emergencies, we need to pay attention to what the epidemiology tells us with regard to who is at unusual risk for that particular kind of emergency. So I would say, for example, in Florida, and we've seen this in other weather-related emergencies, that it appears pretty clear that older adults and people with disabilities are at disproportionate risk in weather-related emergencies.
And we're very fortunate in Florida because we don't have very many people over age 65.
Well, but the reason I raise that is that in part because I don't think we in public health do a particularly good job of starting with that assumption of what did we learn from a particular emergency, and then how should that inform our work the next time. So I would say, for example, I'd be critical of myself for when I was at the local and state level, that we didn't say, having seen, we didn't pay as much attention to the fact that in the example I gave, older adults and people with disabilities meant we needed to do particular kind of planning for the next emergency for those populations with a deeper dive about what makes them particularly vulnerable when you, for instance, you have to relocate to an alternative site and live in a gymnasium or someplace else for a period of time. So I think it really is that combination of diving deeply when you're talking into the specifics, when you're talking about a particular type of a tragic, horrible event and who's more vulnerable and how can you work on the resiliency and reducing risk there, but at the same time realizing that on a chronic level, day in, day out, and when a bad event occurs, certain populations are always going to be at disproportionate risk.
So John, if I could I follow up for just a
Sure.
half a second? And that is the work that the TIFA is doing right now with Hartford Foundation. Yeah. I think that is directly on point. Do you want to talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, thanks. We've in recognizing for that public health mainly for our history and our lack of resources, aren't working with older adults and people with significant disabilities, we began a project to develop what we call age-friendly public health. And we developed a framework and began to reach out to partners like the area agencies on aging and AARP, but we decided to do a Florida pilot where we worked with the Surgeon General of Florida, the Secretary of Elder Affairs, the Governor's Office, and all the local health departments, or most of the local health departments in Florida. And we're now doing a pilot to say, what would it take, what would it mean for you to prioritize those populations? A starting point is data, for example, and so for the first time, in scores of counties in Florida, working with the state health department, they're developing profiles of older adults and their vulnerabilities, their strengths, their own abilities, not just on health, but social determinants of health. Thinking about, and then going to community meetings, working with partners, hearing what the community says, hearing social isolation rising to the top as maybe the #1 issue, and then thinking, how do we, without even any new money, go back and look at all the work we're doing and check, are we doing enough in our planning to address this particular population? Many of the health departments are saying, we just haven't, and it's good for us to be thinking about that, but we need support, we need resources, training, skill building. So we think this is an example of what we should do, not just in Florida, but around the country, and more states are saying, how do we get involved in focusing on those populations as well? And maybe I would just say just quickly at the end, we realize that to do that you need resources, and that so we're also have at the federal level developed proposed authorization language and appropriation language that would create at the Centers for Disease Control an age-friendly public health program that would provide hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of resources that would go out to the local and states to build that capacity and make sure that units had that you had expertise that you could draw upon and not simply be told this is an important population. But sorry for the detour, but that's,
I think
an example of that.
No, that's perfect. Kevin?
So I wanted to tag on to one of John's comments about public health and challenging us. We talk and we have heard, and of course we're talking about quality improvement and innovation and data-driven initiatives. But I think one of the challenges that we struggle with in public health is how do we communicate that, particularly to partners who are not within public health. And so if you think about emergency responders, they don't care about the epidemiology. They just want to go out and make things better. And I think we can communicate with them using their language, but then instilling the public health piece as part of that. And so, for example, and I've received some pushback on this, and I welcome that, but I had a conversation recently in New Jersey with some of the state leadership because they're very much now focused on health equity. And I said to them, well, why are you focusing on health equity instead of just equity? Let's focus on equity. And they said, well, we're just the health department. We can't focus on equity. We need to focus on the health side of equity. And so that reminded me that, I've said for years and years and years, public health is everywhere. Everything is connected to public health. We just have to figure out how to draw those connections. And certainly if we talk about equity or health equity, if we focus on equity, that's a language that resonates with partners outside of public health. And health equity doesn't necessarily resonate with those same partners. But if we focus on equity and we can draw the connection to public health and we can talk about improving education, we can talk about improving transportation, which aren't those traditional health pieces, but certainly are focused on equity, then we're automatically, if we can improve those areas, improving health equity within those communities. And so I think we need to do a better job at the storytelling and using the language of others as opposed to just the epidemiology and data of public health. And so, in fact, I was talking to Dr. Heist yesterday, and she was referencing somebody talking about the nexus of politics. Public health is the nexus of politics and science. And I always drop back to a very old definition of public health that talks about art and science. And I think we focus a lot on the science, and we need to spend a little bit more time focusing on the art and the communication piece, particularly if we want to draw in the community and want to draw in new partners that are focused on communities as opposed to just focused on the health side of that community.
Roger, can you pick up on that?
Sure. I'll go back to your, to the other question. I mean, this distinction between natural hazards, disasters, I mean, they are distinct, but they also are not distinct. I mean, and you think about climate change, right? That is a chronic situation that's causing lots of despair and a slow kind of emergency, but then it manifests itself in a acute emergency in terms of the higher frequency of hurricanes and the volume of water in it. So it's both. It is both an acute kind of event, and it's also a chronic event. It's also, we were in putting together the Foundation's climate change initiative. We went to South Florida, to Miami, this climate refugees, who they refer to themselves as, traditional residents of Little Havana inland, who are being priced out of their neighborhoods by coastal people who believe appropriately that coast may not be there, pushing them out into northern Florida, which they describe as another country.
I think northern Florida, I'm 16 miles from the ocean, and I'm sure I'm going to have oceanfront property. So, yeah, absolutely.
What is sort of chronic, what is acute? We need to understand the relationship between the two. One of the things that that's also kind of interesting is, and all of us who've done preparedness and response, when there is a regional kind of disaster, there is an uptick in togetherness. We're all in it together. But that doesn't often incorporate the underlying disparities and differences, so that that after sort of the acute event's over, or in the long tail of recovery, we aren't consistent in dealing with, and since this came up before in the panel, that some of your neighbors started in a much more difficult place than you did, and they're going to, and they are not going to bounce forward with that in the usual way we deal with recovery. So I wanted to mention that piece too, and then since I'm rambling, I'll ramble one more time. Sure. The other thing is, you get a lot of pushback from our community partners about the term resilience, and we need to be really aware of that, because sometimes, I've had some of our community partners say, well, that just is like telling us we should have more grit, and that comes from, theoretically we're talking about community resilience today, but a lot of the theory of this comes from very individualistic, social psych, individual kinds of things. But a lot of community residents and people with a lot of lived experience around these disparities see resilience language as, well, why don't you just kind of pull up your bootstraps? Is that what? And that's off-putting, and it's been interesting in the dialogues we've had. Some community activists have said we should be using a different term. I think we should be explaining this better. But I also want to raise that this can be off-putting if it does appear that you just want people to, if you don't put the social determinants and equity context around it.
Well, there's so many things that have been discussed by all of you. I want to try and maybe combine a couple of them. We'll see how successful. And you've ruined all my questions, by the way, because you keep answering them. But that's good. There are two things I want to maybe push on, but let me just go with the first one here. It sounds like it's impossible to really have a meaningful conversation about community resilience unless we're also having a conversation about equity, unless we're also having a conversation of social determinants of health. And how do you engage others in that conversation in a meaningful way in the communities in which you're representing? So, and maybe Nicole would that be? I love to hear about what you're doing with your health enterprise zones and how you're making that happen there.
Absolutely. So with health equity zones, our focus is to make sure that the community's voice is at the center. And I appreciate what Kevin was saying in terms of really having that equity component be key. The way we've approached it is attempted to change the understanding of health. because most people automatically think of health care as being what we mean when we say health. And so we actually say health care makes up 10% of what makes someone healthy. As a clinician, myself, an adult and pediatric infectious disease physician, I can very proudly say that only 10% of what I did in the examination room contributed to someone's actual well-being and health. And it was really where the person lived, what access to education and transportation, and fresh fruits and vegetables, and green space, and absence of violence and other concerns that actually impacts all of our health outcomes. And being from New York City, can be familiar with changing a zip code and seeing totally different life expectancy and health outcome changes. So with that understanding, we approached the Health Equity Zones initiative as a way to, with structured public health principles that I've been mentioning, really support the community in building the capacity that they need to actually take steps towards achieving the shared goals that they have with measurable outcomes. A lot of that work was happening before, but oftentimes in silos or people duplicating efforts, and is really to get all of the different members of the community around one table moving in a shared direction. So with our Health Equity Zones initiative, the collaborative that they were required to organize included members 20 to 60 from all sectors of the community. Municipality leadership, health system, education system, city planners, law enforcement, community members themselves, and residents. And I'll give two specific examples of some of the outcomes that we've had from Health Equity Zones, and it reflects back to the question you just asked. We just had a gas outage in our coldest days in Rhode Island, in a particular area in Rhode Island, and needed to reach the most vulnerable populations there because there were people that were going to be without heat for several days with significant concern. And so from the governor's level through to state leadership, there was tremendous dependence on an appreciation for the health equity zone in that community to reach out to the populations that folks may not have been connected with. You know, our electrical company was offering, at the governor's request, offering reimbursement for hotel stay and for food, and we needed to make sure that those vulnerable populations that might not have had their TV on or their internet going could have access to it, and our Health Equity Zones leadership for that community was instrumental in making that happen. That was a response to a disaster, community resilience example. Another Health Equity Zone used the opportunity that was pulled together to leverage taking a building that was in the center of their community, totally dilapidated for many years. There had been movement to try to improve that, but with the Health Equity Zones galvanizing around all of the resources at the table of the community members who knew what needed to be done, that building, with support from the community's developmental corporation in that area, has been renovated, with the upper levels of the building becoming low-income housing available for the community members, and the lower level of that building became a grocery store that sold locally grown food, as well as a job training opportunity to be a chef within that grocery store for youth who were being discharged from the juvenile center from there. So that Health Equity Zone worked on housing availability, economic opportunity, education, fresh fruits and vegetables, access to what was needed in that neighborhood, and that also is a demonstration of community resilience.
Whoa, very powerful.
You know, maybe I would build on that and just give a different type of example of community input. I think that we talked earlier about sort of emergencies that come up, like major weather-related emergencies or other kinds of emergencies. But what I think the the data indicate to us is there are certain periods in people's lives where there's a critical event may occur that may make them incredibly at risk. And the epidemiology for drug overdoses and suicides suggests major transitions in people's lives that can be traumatic are like critical moments. We found when I was a state health commissioner, for example, that the suicide rates and the suicide ideation was highest when we looked at all populations among people coming back from the military, and reintegrating. And we also found, incredible rates of drug overdoses, mostly unintentional, when people were transitioning from coming out of a correctional facility back into the community. Right. And there the question was, what do we do with a particular subset of the community where, defined by certain characteristics? With the recently returned veterans, we realized we just had to go to the veterans themselves and their families and say, what would help? Because the traditional approaches were not there that they would take advantage of. There was this notion of sort of being tough and not asking for help. And so they actually helped to design what the appropriate response should be, and creating hotlines and communication lines where there could be peer-to-peer support, saying, hey, you can't just offer us support, you have to offer our extended family support or it's not going to work. The imagery of the programmatic options had to change. Everything really had to change. And then they were able to say, beyond that, what could you do more upstream that would have prevented that trauma in the reentry period? And some of that same work occurred with people coming out of correctional facilities where, there really were like immediate things like housing and family reintegration that if they weren't addressed in a very supportive way, people were going to experience real crises in their lives. And they and their family members were the ones that really could identify that and come up with the solutions, and then begin to think about criminal justice reform too. But so I would just say, I think there's like community that's geography, and then there's community that's really about a particular shared set of characteristics or life experiences that also, where the same kinds of approaches that Nicole was saying would apply.
And so again, to also build on Nicole's comments, coming from Rhode Island with a state health department and no local health departments, but really depending upon those communities to come together to do the work to build their resilience. And I haven't been able to find the data or the science that supports this, but let me ask first, how many of you would define your health departments as small or medium-sized health departments? So it looks like at least half, if not more than half. My suspicion is, and again, I can't support this, but my suspicion is, anecdotally speaking to people, and I'll ask for some confirmation or at least affirmation, that those small and medium-sized health departments are less resourced than larger health departments, and therefore more dependent upon the partners in their communities to get the work done. And so I think there are lessons to be learned from our small and medium-sized health departments that we can use in the way you're using these health equity zones in Rhode Island, and to build on those partnerships and the resources of diverse partnerships in those communities to improve those communities. At the same time, I think obviously we need to continue to ask for the funding and the resources to help support those activities, but we need to work with those larger health departments who have the systems in place and the policies in place that we can work with those local partners in the smaller health regions where the resources aren't as great. So we're really merging the activities of large health departments and small health departments to build the best that's possible for that community to elevate itself and improve.
And that's why it's so exciting to see ASTO and NACCHO doing this together, because you're really trying to get that alignment to take place in an organic sort of way. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, so I would just encourage the sharing of information between small, medium-sized health departments, large, big cities health departments, state health departments, so that we can share those experiences and those stories and really learn from each other to continue this process.
Going last, I mean, so many things have already been said. I will just a little bit. I ran big health departments, Boston, Seattle, King County, LA County preparedness. I always thought that smaller health jurisdictions, because they were more proximate to communities, have an edge over us. Because I'll just go back to our experience in LA County. How do resilience does come down to almost to the community neighborhood level. It's hard to talk about resilience in a big population aggregate because all the factors we've talked about vary so much, right? And when David and I were working on LA Community Disaster Resilience Project, what brings a community of 11 million people together? Well, it's actually, that's not the way to look at it. What are the smaller communities that have specific risk and resiliency and understanding their engagement? So it does, even with the large health departments, it comes down to local small-scale engagement. And I think we really can, that's the bottom line of public health practice. It is very much focused at those levels. And I think we should dynamically learn from each other on that.
Oh, that's great. And again, that's a call for alignment of all the policies and the work that we're trying to do so it gets to where everyone is. Well, let me step back and ask just a couple more things that we need to go, and then we need to get this group a little bit more involved. If you're in Rhode Island or in Massachusetts or New Jersey or the entire planet that you're responsible for, Alonzo, how do we recognize, when we come to community, what is it that we can tangibly say, this is clearly a resilient community, and they've really transformed themselves? Or a community that's like, no resilience taking place here. How do we know it when we see it as people who really are, we're metrics people. We got to have a little more heart, but we're metrics people. So how do we do that?
So as a very specific example, I think we can measure that by the types and diversity of those partnerships. And so if the health department in a community is working with the planning department internally to think about development within that community and how that development is going to impact the health of that community, that's a measure of their working together to build the resilience within the community. If the health department is leading efforts to bring diverse partners together in that community, whether it's the traditional emergency responders or a government or businesses that might be bringing resources into that community, those are all measures of the resilience that you hope then over time to see the outcomes of those partnerships and development and the resources that come with that.
Good. Now, Alonzo, I don't want you to be last each time, so this is a hard question.
This is a hard question. Well,
yeah,
that's a good one.
I was just going to echo whatever's been said.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you get away with that.
Yeah. Well, on this one, I think that, and actually I forgot what I was going to say because I was going to wait for other people to do this. Let's come back to me.
We'll come back.
Come back to me. I really was.
Well, Nick, I know you talked about your outcome measures and things in your health equity zone. So I mean, clearly you've been giving this a lot of thought.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I love the question. Our focus with the President's Challenge and with elevating the community's voice using place-based models like health equity zones is to make it so that this isn't just a project for a certain period of time. What we are looking to do is to transform communities with sustainable changes and outcomes. Also looking at the policies and systems in place at the community level. One of the more exciting outcomes components from one of our health equity zones is the resident that got involved ran for council and is now one of the council members. We want to start to see changes in policies and systems and have the community feel empowered to drive that, know how to reach out to their legislators and get things, know how to become one of the legislators and get things changed. And when you start to see those types of influences and impacts and transformations take place at the community level, so it's not just the community saying, hey, we need help, but all actually, taking that power to drive the changes that are needed. That is what our vision is of accomplishing the community resilience. And from the metrics standpoint, having health equity metrics or community resilience metrics is something that we want to continue to strive towards. So with a couple of years of working on it in Rhode Island, we have recently released our first set of statewide health equity indicators that we want to be able to use to say, here's what your health equity measures were prior to an intervention. Here's what happens when you implement health equity zones or one of the other community resilience or other programs that are possible. And then here's what happens to those metrics. We have 15 core indicators that circle around 5 domains, and just to share how it's a little bit different, community resiliency is one of the indicators that are on there that include things like civic engagement, how much are people voting and contributing to that, social vulnerability, what are the housing policies like for folks connected to that as well, making equitable housing policies, and looking at violence and how that's being addressed at the community level. We also have a tree canopy measure as another example, knowing about climate change and how that impacts communities. We can map out areas of Providence even where you see the tree canopy number significantly higher in the more affluent neighborhoods compared to that in the others. And so being able to have some of those metrics to guide what we're doing and making sure that we're seeing the empowerment of the community are ways that we are looking to say, as community resilience, let's keep that moving forward and spread it.
Oh, that sounds great. Now, Alonzo, I'm going to try this again because I know you're ready. Okay, I want to be sure you're ready. So there's all these cultural health metrics that I'm thinking about, and I know you are now as well. So share those with us.
Actually, I'll tell you, I was deep in thought about what represents a resilient place, and actually, I was thinking about how the Californians here, Stockton. And I was thinking about Stockton as a resilient place, because and if anybody's here from California, you know that Stockton had been marginalized. It's that place that you might have to stop for gas as you drive up from Southern California to the Bay Area. But it has a resurgence. It has a young mayor. It's doing one of the nation's first guaranteed income experiments. It has begun to invest in housing, community development.
Are you talking about Norway, or are you talking about a place in California?
I'm talking about Stockton, California.
All right, I just want that clarification.
I know.
I'm sorry.
And so I was thinking about a place that I would say is resilient because it is moving forward. It is way beyond the Stockton that was marginalized. Now, it will be an interesting thing to look at. We're going to evaluate the impact of this guaranteed income. So watch our website as we're able to produce some of the information on that. But we want to watch what happens with that in building resiliency. And we also want to watch what's happening because people from the Bay Area are moving to Stockton because they can't afford to live in San Francisco. Is that a resilient dynamic, or is that a gentrification dynamic? So all around resiliency is at maybe kind of a point in time, a look at a trajectory. That's I think the important thing. On the culture of health measures, exactly what you're looking at, Cole, are the things that we looked at in those 35 measures, right? Culture of health measures are things like a culture of health shouldn't have mass incarceration. A culture of health should not have high ACEs scores, should not have residential segregation. or high housing unaffordability. Voting is an index in there, civic engagement. So those, I think of those, this is where social health equity metrics and resilience metrics merge. And I would also say, and I'm a methodologist kind of guy, I would say let's think about the convergence of these metrics and not the distinctness of it. That's why I mentioned, if there are 40 different prevailing constructs for measuring resilience, that's too many. And I think we should think about fewer. Fewer is better in measures. And I think the other thing I would mention that's kind of a related topic we as public health should think about is well-being measures. We talk about well-being. Everybody knows the WHO definition, but the rest of the developed world, actually the rest of the globe, uses well-being metrics to proxy measure things like resilience in communities. We should be incorporating these well-being measures, objective and subjective well-being measures. On this work on opioids, if we'd been tracking subjective well-being measures, we would have picked up cultures of despair it's a trailing indicator is morbidity and mortality and death and naloxone. The well-being metrics would pick up despair early in that trajectory. We don't do enough with metrics that capture those dynamics.
That's fascinating, but you also think about when we have relatively large data at community levels, we're back to LA, or even the county level, it can mask those pockets of despair within those larger communities. And sometimes when the community overall is doing well, we miss those folks who are more vulnerable because the data and not at the census tract or even smaller. John, so you've got 45 constructs to choose from. Which are you going to point us towards?
On this issue? So one thing I would say about this is the benefit of having the measures that Nicole and Alonzo were talking about, it isn't just to, I think, identify vulnerability, it's also to identify strength.
Exactly.
Because I think there are many low-income communities and communities of color around the country where people are doing amazing things, and those communities are working, and they're not only resilient, but there's a lot of well-being. I've had the pleasure of working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and looking at some of the Culture of Health awardees at the local level, and just my mind has been blown about these small communities that sometimes no one has heard of. A rural community where they are just have figured out how, in spite of the significant issues, how to really function well. And we have a lot to learn from those communities too, because they have figured out how to create, in spite of the things that they're facing, poverty, racism, et cetera, they figured out how to make their communities work, and understanding those strengths and what works in those communities, I think, is something that will help us in terms of scaling that kind of activity, but also not sort of having a stereotype that you're automatically in poor health if you happen to fit into this or that demographic group. I think we have to look for the positive examples too.
Yes. So, John, that's again a great point. So my actual day job is I'm chair of a department at an academic institution, loosely on the word academic, that looks at equity issues and how they converge. And one of the ways we do that is we do look at positive deviance models.
Right.
And so what John is describing, places that you would think would be least likely to meet our definitions of resilience or equity or have terrible social terms and yet are rising to the top. What's unique about those communities? It's time to turn this conversation and get some thoughts from all of you that you want to either have some comments or some specific questions for our group. And there should be a moving microphone. I see that microphone moving in a couple places. Whitney, there's a few people who want to get involved. So does someone have that microphone? Yes. Okay, great.
Hello?
It sounds like it's live.
Hello? Thank you. This is really great. I think for a lot of us, thinking about the practicalities of how you apply these concepts to actual work is just really where it gets challenging. I'm Margaret Reed. I'm from Boston, so we've had the pleasure of actually visiting Rhode Island. And so I did want to direct this question to Dr. Alexander Scott. I noticed you used the term mobilizing, and then some of the measures were around housing policy and tree canopies. So I feel like there's a community organizing dimension in this that, and I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to how your government agency can be supportive of and interacts with community organizers and community organizing.
That's a great question. I would hope that part of the Health Equity Zones initiative that we have really focuses on that community organizing quality and strength. And so we see ourselves as the conveners from the department's standpoint. We oftentimes have to remind ourselves to step back. We're oftentimes humbled because we want the community's voice to go forward first and foremost, which is an element of the community organizing. And we encourage them to remind us of that, which they have no problem doing, which is an important component to it. And from our standpoint, the keys are including the structured elements that we are adding to this. And so that's why I often reference what was shared earlier today, that we are bringing to the table the public health principles to support the work that they're doing, so that those that we are speaking to see that this is structured, they're data-driven, community needs assessments that are available and done for each health equity zones. There are outcome measures that they are working towards, work that's implemented, outcomes that have been achieved, and things that we are evaluating. So that folks can see when it comes to the sustainability piece, which is a big part of what we talk about, that there's a ready-made infrastructure to invest in. And so we've supported them with technical assistance in creating that additional sustainability funding. There's been a $2 million grant awarded to one of the health equity zones from SAMHSA. Our Rhode Island Foundation has awarded 6 of the health equity zones with funding to continue for the next several years. It's a ready-made investment, and we want to use that on our structured end to support do your thing from a community organizing standpoint, because that's the way this is going to be sustained. It's not us coming in and saying this is what you need to do. It's supporting them in being able to develop that.
Great, great. Can you identify yourself too? And
Good morning.
it is.
Okay. Carrie Brennan from the City of Austin Public Health Department, and my question is to Kevin, please. You mentioned earlier having conversations about health equity and why not equity. What are your suggestions on having health departments be more comfortable with talking about race and racism? Because having a conversation about equity, you can't avoid race and racism.
So that's an easy question, Kevin.
So my initial thought, I haven't actually given that a lot of thought, but my initial response, I'll probably regret it, but I'm going to put it out there anyway because it starts the conversation, right? So if we have the right partners at the table and those relationships have been developed over time where there's trust, then I think we can have those conversations about race and racism, and we can depend upon those partners who are in different sectors within that community to help us convey our message, but through them, much as Nicole is talking about, the community driving it. So I really think it's about that partnership building and assuring that it's not the comfortable partners or the easy partners, but all the partners that would help us have conversations around that issue.
You have to talk about marginality that makes people have chronic bad health outcomes and even exacerbated bad outcomes in a disaster. We're trying to help provide tools at the foundation for how you do this. Go on the website. We have a series of reports on health equity, which talks about how you can talk about this with a variety of organizations. It's a major piece that we're trying to support. A national dialogue of making health equity the focus, a major focus of what we do in public health. But look for some of those tools on our website.
So it sounds like a great summary. There's tools and partnerships. Kevin's got another idea.
Yeah, it takes me a long time to process things. Introverts were talking about introversion earlier, so we think a lot. I don't think that's without risk. And I am personally experiencing that, I think, although I don't know this for a fact right now, because one of the, and those from New Jersey know the New Jersey structure where we have some, fair amount of competition for providing health services amongst the towns. And I had a community with a very strong Hispanic population, and we tried really hard to connect and converse with that portion of the community, and there was a lot of pushback, and it's resulted in so much pushback that I'm no longer providing services to that community. And I don't know that it was just that piece. There may be other pieces, nobody will really say, but I suspect that had something to do with it. So I think we need to be willing to take those risks, and if it doesn't work, then we try something else, but if it does work, then we're improving things.
Okay. There's somebody, yes, thank you. Can you identify yourself and ask your question or comment?
Hi, Kelsey Lyon from Larimer County Department of Health and Environment in Colorado. And we are really working on developing a community governance board that will be the decision makers for our community health improvement plan. And as we're getting this kicked off, we're realizing a lot of our residents who are identified specifically because of their lived experience and being representatives from under-resourced populations do not understand that they are the decision makers. And so we have not even introduced our community partners yet because we really want to get our community members to understand that their voices are the governance of this process. They're not a vote, they are the vote, and our community partners can listen to what they want to say. So I guess for the equity zones, I wanted to know, what is your percentage of kind of partners who are part of this kind of broad public health ecosystem, and what is the percent of residents? And then how do you maintain kind of a power dynamic that allows residents to voice their opinions at an equal or greater level than the health department and the school districts and all of the people who are already in power within our communities?
That's excellent. The short answer is keep going at it. Don't give up on that. Within our health equity zones initiative, and each zone has to have a collaborative, we require them to have a backbone organization that we interface with directly in terms of getting the funding and being the glue for that collaborative so that they can work towards the shared goals and outcomes. It's supposed to be a community selected agency that is the backbone organization. And we require the members of the collaborative to be members from the community. So that's a key component to that. But you always have to stay engaged and work that balance to make sure that the community members' voices are heard. That's why I get so excited over the example that was shared of that person that felt her voice heard so well that she, ran for city council and wanted to make sure more people heard her voice. So it's an active work in progress that you can keep striving towards.
And that may be the perfect way to close this, that community resilience and all the things that we need to be doing as public health. And there's so many more conversations we need to have about this. I had 30 more questions, but I won't ask them now. But we're going to go on break, and before we do, I want to, of course, thank our panelists for contributing their thoughts and wisdom. So please join me in thanking them. And you have a 30-minute networking break. I believe it's 30 minutes. And this is one of the important things about the open forum. It's a chance to meet someone you don't know. So those of you who are, again, experienced recidivists at open forum, please gently have a conversation with someone who's here for the first time and share some wisdom and insights and ask them to do the same. Thank you so much.